So, Mina Fazel is a professor of adolescent psychiatry at the University of Oxford and a consultant in children's psychological medicine at the Oxford Children's Hospital. She's been working on mental health issues concerning refugees for almost 2 decades, and her work has 2 focuses: how best to provide mental health services for hard-to-reach populations, and secondly, improving access to evidence-based therapies, such as for... Please welcome Mina to the stage, the virtual stage, and stick around because afterwards we'll have speeches and birthday cake. And our executive director, Anna, will be speaking. Okay, welcome Mina.
Hi, can you hear me? Is this all right? Very nice to meet you all. I'm very, very sorry not to be there. I had planned to be there, but I won't bore you with the reasons as to why that didn't happen. But I begged the organisers not to write me off for future talks and anything like that. But I'm really, really delighted to come and talk to you, especially at this incredibly poignant time when issues about refugees have to be at the fore, issues of kind of human relationships and what it means to be human and what it means to represent our humanity in a democratic society. I think it has to be at the fore. So I'm Mina Fazel, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I work at the University of Oxford, and for 20 years I've been very interested in refugee children, the mental health of refugee children. And more it's making me think about the importance of the post-migration environment. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Very aware that you've had a day filled with really interesting talks, but I am here. I am also happy to be interrupted during my talk. So I leave the organisers to coordinate that, but please feel free to kind of just interrupt me if you've got any questions, because that's what I would have wanted if I was in the room, and I'd be very grateful if you pretended I was in the room and just interrupt me. So I'm just going to share my screen and hope that you can see that. Is there an organiser there that can confirm you can see that? Is that all right?
Yep, that's perfect. We can hear you, we can see you, we can see your PowerPoint.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, I can't hear you or see you, so I do hope you will right that wrong and start talking to me as well if you can. So I'm really curious to think about what I call, like, what kind of refuge do we think the post-migration society of the UK is, and what can we do about that? So that's what I really want to talk about, is my reflections on that after kind of working in this field for quite a long time. And I suppose I'm not sure what I've learned, but I'm just going to reflect. So this is a picture I've shown in the past, but I just love it because I think it's so beautiful and meaningful. So it's a 17-year-old drawing a picture of their life so far. So they do the diary script, they write in the diary script, which is in the opposite direction to the way that we write. I always get my lefts and rights wrong when I talk and I'm facing, so I just point from the right-hand side of the screen to the left is the way that they write. So he's 17 and he left Afghanistan when he was about 12. So this is a depiction of his life so far. So I'm not going to psychoanalyze this picture because I don't think you need me to, and I'm not a psychoanalyst, I'm just a boring psychiatrist. But basically, these are off the picture, the graves of his parents. This is a young person who had to go across the mountains from Afghanistan into Iran with another young companion. And tragically, his companion was shot dead in that journey. So these were treacherous journeys and have been for years, because this was, he drew this for me about 8 years ago. So this is a really, really kind of long-standing area of terrible instability. He then spent a couple of years in Iran. Now, I'm Iranian, although I've never been to Iran, but I do understand that life for Afghans in Iran isn't easy. So if we think about the post-migration environment for this young fella, he early on experiences Well, you see his depictions, you see these little bits of green here in Afghanistan, these bits of green in the UK, but absolutely none in Iran. So, you know, what must that have been like, someone from the age of 12 to 14 living on their own in Iran, and then eventually, and I don't know how, was able to make this long, treacherous journey to the UK, even taking a boat years before this became kind of in the public domain across the Mediterranean, where the boat that he was in did actually come into difficulties, and a large number of individuals, including the friend that he had made subsequently with whom he was travelling, tragically drowned. And then he arrived in the UK, and I saw him a year and a half after he had settled. So, like, a lot has happened before he arrives, but from my perspective, these kind of depictions of red or pain or distress or suffering or whatever it is that they're there, I think are just totally unacceptable when it comes to the post-migration environment. Like, in a way, as a UK citizen, I you know, there are variable things that I can do with probably limited influence in this bit, but when it comes to the UK, we really, really have to be doing better. And I don't know, it just feels we're doing worse and worse and worse. And I remember when I started work in this area 20 years ago, I thought, oh, well, probably after 5 years, there'll be no issues. I won't be doing this for long, but how wrong I was. So what I'm going to do is talk about the refugee health needs of refugee, the mental health needs of refugee children, as that's my area. And then thinking about what we can do in prevention, and that's the post-migration environment really, and then the impact that this work has on the wider system, because I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that it's incredibly powerful work with these communities, and we can learn so much about working with other communities in the UK from actually these communities as well. So this is the latest data that's available, but obviously it's likely to be different. But this is a graph of newly displaced people per minute. I love it because it's actually just thinking it's per minute. This is constantly happening. And in 2003 to 10, we thought it was quite high and there was quite a lot, but then there have been these, you know, more recent horrific upheavals and turbulences that have just increased the numbers of exposed individuals. And if you think about it, most refugee populations, 50% or so, are under the age of 18. So the number of children growing up in these contexts is really, really concerning. And obviously, for obvious reasons, you know, this figure was from the first half of 2021, so it doesn't capture a lot of the turbulence of the Afghan migration flows of 2021, and then what's happening tragically this year. So again, this is from the end of 2020, so this is like change, but you know, this is the international displacement location. You know, where did they come from? So Syria, Venezuela is interesting because it doesn't reach us much, but a lot have been displaced for complex economic and political reasons in Venezuela. Then Afghanistan, but you know, a lot of significant numbers in sub-Saharan Africa, Myanmar, Central African Republic. So sorry, you might not be able to read this. So I'll just say this is Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan in descending order. And then, well, by the end of 2020, where were they living? So the top country here is Turkey, likely to still be pretty high now, but that is obviously constantly shifting these numbers. Then Colombia, then Germany, then Pakistan, then Uganda, then the United States. So these European countries, Germany is pretty high, but a lot of other countries don't. And then obviously I do think it's really interesting to look at this per head of population, and then Turkey does come across very high, as does Lebanon and Jordan. And then obviously, not only have we had the situation in Afghanistan and the current situation in Ukraine, but we've also had COVID making all of this much more difficult, because from the perspective of individuals who are forced migrants in the UK, the kind of fear, the locking away, the manner in which everything, and individuals and statutory bodies and politics were responding could all potentially be incredibly triggering of previous traumatic events. So you've got individuals who might not speak the language well, who might not have access to great networks of support, who might have great socioeconomic deprivation. And then on top of that, then they've experienced kind of a lot of the mixed messages around COVID, the impact on living circumstances, and all of this for someone who might have experienced torture and trauma prior to coming to the UK. This is likely to make it incredibly worse. And on top of that, any of those who are lucky enough to be in treatment were also not able to access that care easily. So a lot of mental health services were able to continue during the pandemic with tele-psychiatry, we call it, or kind of remote consultations. But in mental health, it isn't the best alternative source. Well, it's same for a lot of the other health conditions where you might need to feel an abdomen or listen to a chest. But, and although, you know, a lot of the work did continue, the areas that were stopped kind of quite quickly and not resumed online were those of trauma treatments, because they are quite difficult treatments. You have to often be in the same room, you're reliant on really skilled interpreters to be able to work with you in a manner that, you know, that it can be quite difficult for the interpreter, let alone for everyone else in the room. And so actually this added a totally new level of kind of complexity and difficulty of, you know, how do you access care when you don't necessarily understand the health system? Like, honestly, very few people who've born in the UK and lived under the umbrella of the NHS all their lives understand how it all works, let alone if you come from a health system that's completely different, and often from countries that have poorly evolved mental health services. And instead, mental health kind of is a lot of stigma around it, a lot of fear around being labelled with mental health problems or what might happen as a result of accessing it. And then there's a lot of further complexity amongst families, especially asylum-seeking families in the UK, who might worry that if they have any observable mental health problem, that might lead to them being removed from the UK. It might compromise their asylum application. I don't think there's truth to that, but I think there's a real fear around that. So, you know, thinking about the individuals seeking refuge during the time of COVID, so in the periods that we were being locked down in the UK, there was a 40% increase in the need for humanitarian aid across the world. The dangerous journeys of those seeking asylum became even more dangerous, and there were increasing use of detention centres, and also just the problems encountered in detention centres with the spread of COVID and the difficulty of caring for individuals in those contexts. And then, as I've said, the profound isolation and the economic fallout. So one study of refugee population showed that 77% of those who had jobs had lost them in the lockdown. So this kind of impending destitution we can't ignore. And then just, I thought I'd put a slide on the Ukraine. I know it's been discussed a lot, but, you know, I'm involved in a research project in the Ukraine, looking at refugees from Russia into Ukraine, and also internally displaced persons from another part of the Ukraine into this area. So, you know, this study is taking place in one of the cities that has been terribly hit already. And, you know, it is really desperate for all the staff working with us, for all the individuals who have given us data, the fear they have. We've had to destroy the majority of what we've collected so as not to, but actually they don't know that. And so you're just thinking about these, you know, already displaced individuals and what must they be going through now. So now this is me trying to get you all to come and join me in studying refugee children and refugee mental health issues. But, you know, why is this so interesting? Because, well, basically, these groups suffer all the problems that socially marginalised populations suffer, but also forced migration, experiences of persecution, emotional and physical trauma, and for unaccompanied minors, the loss of a primary caregiver too. So we get insecurity at an important stage of development that can either enhance or threaten well-being. And I think we have to be careful not to assume that it's all the outcomes are negative. That's absolutely not the case. And why I think we have so much to learn from these populations, and the resilience and the understanding of the pathways to that is that actually everyone is able to potentially learn from it. And they also have diverse needs of support. So I'm not going to go over this too much because I would imagine you have been discussing much of this today, but it's a very prominent problem. There are lots of areas crucial with the determination of health, biological and the individual, with the familial, the family context and the community context, and the environmental and social. And so all of this seems to come together. But we have a lot of challenges. The evidence base is pitiful. And then, the context of sensitivity, if we talk about our response in the UK to the forcibly displaced populations, we can't actually make generalizations because, the Afghan populations arriving in the UK are likely to have very different needs to those coming from other areas. And so it's quite difficult to have these kind of blanket approaches when actually we need a lot more sensitivity and nuancing. But from a mental health perspective, you get a lot of the most common presentations around anxiety and sleep that can present with anxiety and depression that can present with sleep problems, with what we call somatization, so headaches, abdominal pain, back pain, and what we call comorbidity. So actually the norm is that, you don't just have an isolated problem, but the most likely thing is you might have anxiety and depression together, or depression and post-traumatic stress all together. And so with regards to trauma reactions, there's a great range of the reactions to trauma. They get this whole kind of spectrum of short and long-term consequences to grief and exposure to potential traumatic events. And at the extreme end of that is what we call PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And that has been studied a lot because it's kind of a diagnosable, it lends itself to study for researchers who have short periods of time, who have to apply for funding, rather than being able to do the important work, I think, which is to understand the intersectionality really of all these different influences on health and well-being and the social context. Just kind of a lot of kind of isolated things are studied. It's useful they're studied, but we do have limitations on what we do know, but PTSD has been studied quite a lot. And then the other area where these individuals come to awareness of services is with what we call protection concerns, so safeguarding concerns around safety. So there are different exposures really, and different patterns of responding to trauma, and actual just cultural differences in the manner in which families interact and children are raised. But in the UK, and I think rightly so, there's a certain kind of absolute things that can't happen. For example, physical violence towards children, physical violence with families are things that the state and statutory agencies can intervene with. And so these do come to services, and then threats of harm to self and others. And we see a lot of those threats of harm to self around times when individuals think their assignment determination decisions will be coming through, and actually what they might do if they're forcibly returned to their countries of origin. But as I said, these groups have many strengths as well. So the majority do have good outcomes. So, studies of Sudanese adolescents in America, for example, they said they did better, but if they felt safe and supported in the post-migration environment. And Australian school children, refugee children, self-reported better mental health than those of the local population. So, I do think when we think about young refugees, we need to think about pre-migration, peri-migration, post-migration influences across all of these areas: the individual, the family, the community, and broader society. What we do know is that the more numbers of potentially traumatic events that these individuals are exposed to, the more likely they are to have mental health problems. So, it sort of makes sense. It's about severity and sheer number. And then, I think this post-migration environment is pretty bleak, it's pretty cloudy, we're pretty unfriendly. I've interviewed 60 unaccompanied minors who'd arrived in the UK, and they'd on average been here around 4 years. And this was across England, Wales, and Scotland. And not one of them had had a meal in the home of a white British person, however they chose to interpret that. So they did feel increasing inclusion in school over time, but that didn't necessarily translate into anything that they recognized as more meaningful in the more domestic context. And these were not your average group. They were a group who were in touch with mental health services. But, it's kind of stark reminder those most at risk or those who are struggling most, the extent of isolation that they might be experiencing. So there's our post-migration environment, and obviously I would like us to think really about, within all of this, what can we do? We can really influence the post-migration environment. So just thinking about prevalence of mental health problems. So I've listed this just to say that in all the global studies over the last 10 years, or since 2000, even longer now, up until last year, really good studies that kind of we could include in our systematic view, not even of 800 refugee kids. So given the numbers in the world, the amount of research is just pitiful. But what that research does show is that about a third have PTSD, with similar numbers for adults, and about 14% have depression, and for adult population that's higher, it's around 24%, and about 1 in 5 have anxiety disorders. And what do we know about risk and protective factors? Well, the older the age of the individual when they are forcibly displaced, the more likely they are to have mental health problems. And then family composition is just really, really interesting. It's just really complex. There's no clear pattern. And I think that's about where you end up living. It's where your country of origin is. It's about a whole range of factors. But, there are interesting findings, like, for example, boys living with both parents in one study had 5 times lower rates of mental health problems than those living in any other family arrangements. But there are very, very varying results in the field. With social support and community integration, it's again really, really complicated. So there have been studies of Somali adolescents in the USA, for example, and that's shown that girls, for example, in that study, if they had closer alignment with their Somali culture, they had better mental health, whilst for the males, they had better mental health, they had more closely aligned with American culture. So again, these are complicated, complex issues that individuals, families, communities, both the displaced communities and the host communities need to find ways to help these individuals navigate. And then resettlement locations, formal resettlement locations, was predictive of mental health problems. And actually, these populations are moved so much. It is just horrific. I quite like this. This is a slide showing kind of how we understand all the different factors that take place. So this is the exposure to armed conflict. So from the reason why an individual is forcibly displaced. But we can't ignore, when it comes to mental health, the displacement-related stresses, or what I'm calling the post-migration environment. So the ongoing insecurity in that environment, the socioeconomic deprivation, and the loss of relationships and roles. And actually, there might be quite a lot we can do in that context to think about the needs. And it's not just about kind of mental health support. It's actually just thinking, well, we all stay well because we have strong social networks. We feel valued in our societies. We're able to work in a manner that contributes to the well-being of others. And actually, these are factors that everyone needs, not just the host population. And so that's just thinking about, when we think about mental health needs, that we need to be thinking across the board around these things as well. So what can we do? Coming to preventive interventions and schools. So preventive interventions are quite difficult. It's a poorly developed science. So we know a lot about promotion of mental well-being, like to prevent bullying in schools, or to provide education about mental health. And that's what we call mental health awareness. But actually, how do we prevent it? We don't really know. But we do know how to treat the disorder once it's there. So, if you've developed a depression or PTSD, then, we do know how to treat it. But to prevent it, it's not quite as easy. So then prevention can be thought about in kind of the universal, so preventing mental health problems for everybody versus selected, so preventing mental health problems, from the group that, had to travel in this way over this period of time, which was likely to be highly traumatic, or the group that's indicated. By that we mean those that already are exhibiting overt mental health difficulties. So again, like just working out what we mean by prevention and where we're targeting, it just highlights how difficult it is then to understand how best to prevent. And in child mental health, I think my reading of this field is that we have the best effects if we target at the highest risk groups and not aim to do things for absolutely everyone. So when we thought about how to prevent mental illness in refugees, so sorry, whenever a little picture of somebody comes up, this is kind of work that's been done in collaboration with them, or maybe entirely by them and I'm pretending it's mine. So if you've got a young person experiencing forced displacement in the middle of this slide, what I've put here is all the factors that are really important in mental illness and prevention, but actually really just for general well-being in life. So at the top here, there are kind of individual and group factors, and by that we mean kind of we can provide access to interventions that can improve self-esteem and emotional difficulties, or for those that really are experiencing difficulties, there are very good treatments for PTSD and the other sequelae of trauma. It's just the access to them is difficult, but there's very good treatments, so we really have to think about improving the accessibility of services. When we think about the families that arrive, well, there are very high rates of parental mental illness. If you think about the fact that, I said a third might be suffering from depression and PTSD, for example, and actually a lot of, if you've got post-traumatic stress disorder, it's likely often that these can be shared experiences. So the whole family have been exposed to the same trauma, which in many ways can make it incredibly difficult to treat because they're all struggling, they're all trying to avoid anything that reminds them of it, then one of them goes off for treatment and the other four don't. Well, how does that work? So actually what ends up happening is a lot of times these aren't discussed and treatment is not sought because we really don't know how to treat the family system that has been exposed. And it's really poignant now, isn't it, thinking about the individuals, just who might be, hopefully, depending on how we manage immigration arriving in the UK and, what these experiences of travelling together and the reasons why they had to travel might be. So we know there's some studies that just working on parenting skills can help parents and also just managing aggressive behaviour. So within the home, this is very, very difficult and can lead to responses that can be more aggressive, especially if you're suffering from some of the mental health problems. And then thinking about the importance of social interactions and living circumstances. Well, here we really come to the post-migration environment through and through. Like, how do we enable these individuals, families, communities to build and contribute to the economic and social capital of society? Because that's just so important for everyone to do. They don't really want to arrive here and sit around waiting for their decision to be taken, not working, not contributing. Most of these individuals, have fled because, they've had no choice, but doesn't necessarily, but actually what we then do is close the door to their being able to build the social networks and do the things that actually can enhance their well-being. So across the board, newly arrived populations attribute well-being and success to language proficiency. Ethnic density is important, so a whole range of studies looking at kind of the fact that being the only group from a certain ethnicity in an area actually might not actually be that helpful, but actually we need to think about, and each individual is going to be different, but in general, actually how some communities do prefer to be in proximity to other individuals from that cultural background. And just thinking about local deprivation indices, that many are moved to the most deprived parts of the UK. In Oxfordshire, we see this, they're places and kind of the towns and cities that actually are struggling the most from a socioeconomic perspective is where our large refugee numbers right now are being housed. And then that brings me to schools for young people, just how important this context is. Actually, the importance of fostering a sense of belonging in schools is actually a predictor of good well-being and mental health. these young people. They're interventions for classrooms and to minimise the moves, which is kind of obvious. So we've got to think across the board at interventions and remove these kind of messages in the post-migration environment for individuals who have experienced more than enough before they even get here. I won't talk about family interventions in detail, but just kind of, I've spoken about them before, but I just talk a little bit about a parent with PTSD, just to really think about this. So you've got a parent PTSD and their child. So these are the core symptoms of PTSD for those of you that might be interested. So you get emotional numbing. So you're unable to feel the range of emotions. You don't feel happiness like you did. You don't feel sadness like you did. You're just kind of numb across the board. But you also get this thing we call hypervigilance. So you're ready to run at any moment. So you're kind of at this kind of state of preparedness for the next tragedy that might happen. And that can exhibit itself with flashbacks in the day where, you know, there's something happens that triggers your memory and you see an event that has been highly traumatic for you, or at night with nightmares. You avoid any reminder of any trauma. So, for example, if you were outside walking, or if the children were playing outside and a bomb hit, or whatever might have happened to you at that time, you will avoid any reminder of that. And that can be quite complicated and profound because all the treatments of PTSD are exposure-based. So actually, when individuals are trying to avoid it as much as possible, and then they know that to come and get treated requires exposure, that's a very, very difficult hurdle to jump for many. And then mood disturbance, so increasing depression and anxiety. And so then it's very difficult if you've then got a distressed child to just the added complexity of being there and being a responsive parent to a child who is in distress if you've got this symptomatology in yourself. And so I think a lot of what I'm interested in is thinking about how we can move from that place to that place and how we need to think about our interventions and the way we work. And often in child and adolescent mental health services, we have this, you know, if you're offered an appointment and you don't come, you're often offered another appointment. If you don't come, sometimes you're offered a third appointment, but sometimes you're not, you're just discharged, saying, well, actually, this individual, you know, doesn't seem to want this treatment. We've got these long waiting lists. But actually, like, if you're a stranger, you've also got all these symptoms. It's incredibly difficult to come to services. And so we need to think and rethink how we provide provision for these individuals in this context. So, you know, I just think schools are so important. It's kind of, you know, most children attend, it's a natural focus for families. You can work and talk to teachers. And so actually we need to really think about how to support schools in the essential role they play. And with refugees, they can facilitate access to other services like mental health services, to community supports. They can enable them to build relationships with their peers. Basically, every kid we ever interviewed has said all they want to do is make friends with the other kids in their class, which is basically what any kid in any school, in any class usually wants to do anyway, regardless of background and ethnicity. Desperate for a sense of belonging and the importance of language again. So we in Oxford years ago set up a refugee mental health service where we'd have a weekly meeting at the school, fully aware that, you know, these aren't individuals that will present to mental health services. So we talk with a linked teacher and we discuss the children of concern. We try and understand what's happening. We'd maybe watch, we'd maybe tell them about local resources, advise teachers about how to do it, really not wanting to see kids if we don't need to think of the ways of the environment help. But actually, if we needed to see them directly, that the school would approach the child and or their carer, whatever was appropriate for that situation. If a member of staff at the school was trusted, they would be encouraged to come to the first appointment with the family and child, either for the first minute or 5 minutes of the whole appointment, whatever was appropriate given that context. We would meet at schools. They wouldn't have to go to a strange place, meet strangers, worry about their asylum application in the whole context of that. And we were able to be much more reactive. And then, you know, these are some of the factors for school success that the literature shows, but I won't go over that now. I will just read this young person's account. When we ask kind of how can we help other asylum seekers, it's quite a long account. I'm happy to send it to anyone who'd like to read it all. I don't know, find a way to try and make them feel welcome, because there's not so many people that makes them feel like they're welcome. Jamie, who was a kid at the school, was our main source in the way that he was the first person that made us feel welcome in school. He's a student, but he was the best one ever. If we didn't have Jamie, we wouldn't be here. Nobody would know us. People liked Jamie, and he was a pole that makes the school stand up. So I was quite curious about this. I'm like, so this is basically them talking about a kid in the school who was quite popular, who just decided to befriend them. And I said, kind of, what did he do? They said, well, he helped me. He didn't care who thought about what. He lost friends over helping us, because they were thinking, oh, you spend more time with them than us. He would be with us whenever we needed help. He was there. Even we needed money, we would ask Jamie. I'd say, Jamie, we need money to go there. Okay, here you go. He would give it. All right, obviously we borrowed the money, but he would do it. And in the research and the work we did, it was just so interesting how actually the turning point for so many young children and their families in their kind of ability to settle, in their ability to develop relationships, to even seek mental health support, was when they felt accepted by just one or two kids that they seemed as kind of one of the local kids in their school. But that facilitated this, what we've been calling it, we've called written about a moment of change. It wasn't the day they got their asylum application, or the day they moved into their house. For universally across the board, it was the day that they felt accepted or had made a friend. So I won't talk about that now, but just to say kind of the importance of when we worked in the school, why so many kids said they liked the school mental health service because they felt it was safe. And so we kind of developed this mental health toolbox for teachers working with refugee populations in the school, and developed a whole range of kind of simple things that have up your sleeve in case the child that you're working with presents with something and you feel the need to help them, that the teachers felt more equipped. And actually the teachers actually felt they needed it for all kids. So actually we've stopped calling it for refugees now, but we do have a trauma focus in it, but really for all children that might arrive at non-traditional points of entry, or children that aren't settling anyway. So this is an example of the toolbox. So I've always worried about the kids. Well, I think I shared many of their worries. I've just always worried that they're going to be deported, that they would leave, that they would not come back to school that day. And so many of these events happen at 5 a.m. in the morning, so they often unable to sleep, worried about a knock at the door in the middle of the night. And we would also be worried about, well, what have we done to support these young individuals who might leave at short notice? And so we thought about developing this thing we called the Toolbox, where we would talk with them about this imaginary toolbox, or we would draw it. And I'd initially wanted a kind of big pirate's chest, but actually I quite like this because they're little drawers. So we would say to these individuals, when things are most difficult for you, what types of things can help you? And we would make them put it in, sorry, that's my dog in the background. I'd listen to a piece of music. Which songs, write it down, have it accessible if you've got a phone. I'd talk to a friend, or which friend? What would you say to them? How would you contact them? I'd eat this meal that I like. Well, what meal? And, so we would kind of fill the box with as many different things. So at the time of the most acute stress, they would hopefully be able to pull on one of these resources. We would teach them breathing techniques. They could put that breathing, relaxing technique in the box, depending on what it is they were coming from. So that's just an example of the toolbox. And I'm going to end now with 3 examples of what I think I'm calling the impact on the wider system of this. So the first is that as a result of our work with refugee children in schools in Oxfordshire, we were able to actually transform the way mental health workers across the board were able to work with all schools. And so we built an in-reach service where mental health workers would go into our secondary schools at a fixed time each week. And that then became kind of transformed into what's happening now across the UK with the educational mental health practitioners. But we were able to start that and hopefully give some fuel to the fantastic movement of it. So that, actually, all children were able to benefit and access from kind of a different way that mental health services work and interact with schools, rather than waiting for an individual child to be referred, actually working as a mental health service with the whole system. And that was absolutely came about as a result of a really small service for refugee children. We were able to learn and bring to the table the fact that actually teachers were supporting a lot of refugee children in need, but actually a whole range of other children didn't fall under the refugee label that also had needs. I'm very interested in a therapy called narrative exposure therapy, and this was developed in Ugandan refugee camps. It was developed for lay practitioners to be able to do, because obviously in a lot of these environments you don't have trained mental health professionals, but actually it might not be that you need trained mental health professionals even to give some of the most complex mental health interventions. And so narrative exposure therapy was developed to be able to be done in the most kind of deprived context where you only might have pen and paper if you're lucky, but not even essential to have that. And to actually really treat PTSD with incredibly strong evidence base now, very effectively. But we've now kind of, because narrative exposure therapy, or NET as we call it, has short training, doesn't require, we now actually are using this across the UK in mental health services as a whole, for a whole range of individuals, not only just refugee populations. So how that intervention has actually is now being used with populations across the board. And then finally, kind of just a small thing we're doing in Oxford is, I suppose I've kind of spent so many years working in this field, and I suppose I've become so demoralized and upset at different times. And so kind of, it's very difficult, because sometimes you try and do things and you feel that the outcome's worse for the individuals. I remember when we pushed so much to get children out of immigration detention facilities, and then they did eventually remove children from immigration detention facilities, but they continued to detain parents. So actually what we got was children at these horrific, in the middle of the night, suddenly placed in emergency foster care, not having any idea what's happened to their parents, not knowing when they'll ever be able to meet them again, not being able to communicate with the individuals they're living with. I have been through so many positive and negative waves in this area, that we've just started something very, very small and simple we call the Oxford Refugee Health Initiative, that I think can be done anywhere, where actually we're matching medical students with refugee families or unaccompanied minors to help them better understand and navigate the health system, but actually to just move into actually just a more human, personal link that can actually help, so our medical students would help families find out, because the holidays are such kind of long, empty periods for them, to help understand how they could fill it, because there's so many resources in so many cities and towns, but you've got to know about them, where the museum is, take them to the museum the first time. And so we just kind of become really, really small, really, really local. We're now matching kind of medical students with our unaccompanied minors that are arriving, meeting regularly and helping them navigate the complexity of life in the UK on a personal way. And I think this also has been a great benefit to our medical students as well, who many of them have chosen to go on into the global health field, some of them in the mental health field as well. So those are just 3 examples of what kind of work with refugees, and actually how I think all our medical students who work with this group have better understanding of the needs of all patients who have complex health problems and complex social and health needs, as well as a better understanding of the reality of being forcibly displaced in the UK. So in conclusion, I think we need to think across the board, across socioeconomic and healthcare sectors and schools. We need to think about prevention if we can, and we need to think about the post-migration environment and the host population factors, because we can impact on that. And actually, these communities are incredibly isolated when they arrive. And actually, how do we enable these longer-term, meaningful relationships across homes? The kids that we spoke to have a longing for acceptance, they want to blend to their environment, the importance of peers, and that there's a lot of insecurity linked to racism and bullying. And actually, we have to work with these individuals, because that's why we're human, but also actually there are great benefits to all of us, and there are many examples of that. So we have to think about the focus we need of children and communities and families and peers and schools and policy all working together, not different. And many, many people have worked with me in this area that I thank. So thank you for your time and for listening and for tolerating me not being there. And honestly, I do wish I could have been there with you. But I'm happy to answer any questions if that's what you would like.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Mina. I'm afraid we're not going to have time for any questions today. That was absolutely phenomenal and so comprehensive. But we are severely overrunning, I'm afraid. And yeah, I'm aware that lots of people have to go off. But thank you so much, Mina. That was absolutely amazing. And I'm sure if we could we go back onto that final last slide, which was her handle on Twitter. I don't know if that's possible.
I've got it, but it's not. As long as you know my name, you can find my email.
Yeah, we have linked her on all of our Twitter and Instagram, and we'll circulate that because I'm sure you might have questions about that amazing work. And thank you so much, Mina.